Thanks, Tim. As Tim says, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce my friend Henry Glassie today, and then to interview him. Following tradition, I want to just start briefly with an account of Henry's works and miracles to remind those of us who know Henry and to give some orientation to those who may be new to folklore. Henry Glassie is college professor emeritus of folklore at Indiana University, having also taught in and chaired at the Department of Folklore and Folklife. Hey, Tom. How you doing? At the University of Pennsylvania. In both departments, Henry's been a loyal and generous mentor to hundreds of grateful students and former students, myself included. Before joining the folklore faculty at Indiana, I think it's important to note that Henry served as state folklorist of Pennsylvania. And throughout his career, Henry has been committed to public sector and applied work, especially work with indoor and outdoor museums. I'm thinking of Conner Prairie, Plymouth Plantation, the Ulster American Folk Park, the Frontier Culture Park in Virginia, the Museum of International Folk Art, the National Museum in Bangladesh, the Smithsonian, and others. Let me interrupt myself just to say that there are other sources, published sources out there about Henry's career. One of them is a really good interview that Gregory Hansen did that's published in a 2000 volume of Folklore Forum. The reason I just thought of it is that that interview focuses mostly on Henry's public and applied work. As long as I've interrupted myself. There's another one Barbara Truesdale did in a 2008 volume of The Public Historian. And, here's a shameless plug. The last section of The Individual and Tradition, edited by myself, Tom Mould, and Praveen Shukla.
Really good book.
Yeah, I believe it's pages 499 to 522. Also covers some of this stuff. So for the record, there are other things out there that you may want to turn to because there's no way we're going to cover everything today. So I think it's also fitting to note that Henry became a member of the American Folklore Society in 1964 while he was still an undergraduate right here in New Orleans at Tulane. Maybe we'll hear more about Tulane days in a bit. Henry's remained active in the society ever since. He was elected a fellow of the AFS in 1976. He was elected president for the 1988 to 1990 term. That was during the society's centennial era. And of course, most recently, in October of 2010, Henry received the AFS Lifetime Scholarly Achievement Award. I think it's safe to say that no living folklorist has reached wider for new experience nor produced such a wide-ranging and comprehensive body of scholarly work. You just think about the places that Henry's done field work on every continent except Australia and Antarctica. I'm talking about doing field work in New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and New Mexico, internationally in Fermanagh in Ireland, in England, in Sweden, throughout Turkey, in Italy recently, in the Swat Valley of Pakistan, in Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Tamil Nadu in India, throughout Bangladesh, in Hagi and Seto in Japan, in Pongchong in China, in Bahia, Pernambuco in Brazil, Yorbaland in Nigeria. Next year, I think he's headed to the moon. Point is, he's done field work many places, and I think one of the themes that will come out in today's discussion is the importance of field work. I think it's also important to note, and Henry wants me to truncate this, but I think it's important to review his major works. It will sort of anticipate where we're going with the talk as well. His major monographs include Pattern and Material Folk Culture of the Eastern United States, so that's from 1969, followed by Folk Housing in Middle Virginia, 1976. All Silver, No Brass, An Irish Christmas Mumming, also 1976. Passing the Time in Ballymenown, 1982. This also led to Irish Folk History, 1982, and Irish Folk Tales, 1985. This was followed by The Spirit of Folk Art in 1989, Turkish Traditional Art Today in 1993, Art and Life in Bangladesh in 1997. Material Culture in 1999. This led to smaller volumes, Vernacular Architecture and the Potter's Art. Followed by The Stars of Ballymenown, 2006, and most recently, Prince Twin 77, His Art, His Life in Nigeria, and His Exile in America, 2010. Let me wrap up by saying that in addition to furthering scholarship in our own field, Henry's work has garnered transdisciplinary and public recognition. President Clinton nominated Henry for the National Council on the Humanities in 2000. 3 of his books, Passing the Time in Ballymenown, The Spirit of Folk Art, and Turkish Traditional Art Today, 3 of his books have been named among the notable books of the year by the New York Times. And in November of 2009, Henry Glassie was awarded the Charles Homer Haskins Prize at the American Council of Learned Societies. This award honors a scholarly career of distinctive importance from any of the humanities or social sciences. Previous recipients of the Haskins Prize include Donald Meinig, Helen Wendler, Clifford Geertz, and William Labov. Glassie was the first folklorist to receive the award. Believe it or not, there's a whole heck of a lot of stuff I'm leaving out, but I think we'll get to some of those details as we get to talking. And then, of course, I'd also like to leave some time at the end for y'all to be able to ask questions. So be thinking about that. I'm going to swivel over here. Hey, Henry.
Hey, man.
How you doing? Doing okay?
Just fine.
All right then. Well, I thought it'd be fun to start with the same question that you asked all of us grad students on the first day of intro to graduate study in folklore for many decades, and which is to say, how did you come to folklore? I'm thinking about what early influences or experiences would have shaped your journey to where you are now.
Well, I'm happy to answer that because you told me you were going to ask that question, and I'm therefore prepared. What I want to know is does it make sense for me to be sitting down? I feel a little bit sad that I can't see everybody. What do you think? What do you think? Can you hear me all right in the back?
Yes.
Okay. That's okay. I mean, if it's okay.
You'd rather stand up, stop doing it.
Is that what I would rather do? Is what I'd rather do. I'm not standing up. It's uncoordinated, and you all have to switch around the film. But the trouble is, I taught for 42 years, and during all that time, I always felt it was so important to be able to see the people, and so I found that I couldn't see Tom Mole, and he's one of the handsomest human beings. It seemed to be a kind of depressing thing not to see Tom.
Handsome for like
I can see Ray McDonald, who's maybe the second handsomest, so that's after all growth. But anyway, I knew perfectly well that this question was going to be asked, and it was partially because I always asked at the very beginning, but really that has to do with a little bit of a story, and that is that Richard Dorson, at the very end of his life, said that what he would like to have from his students was not the normal Festschrift that would be articles by the students, but rather the account by those students of exactly how they got into folklore. And that was published many, many years ago in the Folklore Forum, and what I would say as a result of having read that many years ago, that it was very interesting, and this is what Dorson was driving at, since he was a historian, he was interested in the history of the field, that the patterns that would obtain in all those several narratives would reveal something very profound about the discipline. And what you could say very clearly about that group that was gathered at that time is that while there were maybe 120 people who were testifying, there were really only 2 great motives that brought people into folklore, and that's very interesting. One of them was a matter of identity, the other one was a folk song revival. If you were there yesterday, was it yesterday, the day before, for Pravina's panel, you'd notice that there were also, the same question was asked and the same answers revealed the same kind of patterning. It was also true that Steve Foden went a lot of time with you. I don't object, but you must be an important man.
It's the damn public sector.
Yeah, well,
Turn on your phone.
that's all right, I did. Quite all right. Sort of funny. So I'm going to answer the question that Dorson asked of all his people, and that has always been asked at the beginning, and that is how you get into folklore. It was also, the background to this thought is a little bit because I did this work with Roger Abrams. That is, I did Ray's job with Roger. And it was really very interesting, and that was the very first question that I asked Roger. Roger's answer was fundamentally the folk song revival is what brought me in. And if I meditate on that, I find that really both of the motives that were characteristic of Dorson's students. I need a clock, and you know me, I'll talk forever. Both of them were important to me. I'd have to start with it. I remember as a tiny child being struck by the thought that I didn't exist. And it seemed to me as a tiny child, I was sitting under a giant tree on a farm in Virginia, that I was here in the world just to watch and listen. I wasn't an active participant, but I was going to be an observer. And I think that's exactly true. I still have that feeling that maybe I'm not like other people, not because I'm superior, but rather because I'm inferior. And therefore, I admit to being embarrassed by talking about myself. And the only way that I can possibly talk about myself is to talk about other people. It's a little bit like little Bobby Dylan when he did his record of self-portrait. All the songs on it were by other people. It's more or less how I feel about the thing. So I can answer the question that Ray has posed to me only by mentioning those people who constructed me, not by myself. I don't have any idea who I am. The first would be my grandmother. My grandmother was born in the 1880s. I was raised by her during the period when my father was in the Second World War. And she carried an oral tradition that she gathered from her great aunt, Aunt Annie. And as a result of that, I was only one person from the 18th century. I could listen to the stories that seemed more real than the present. That is, the past became very early to me a more real. Penn Warren says about the same thing in his Meditations on the American Civil War, that really the past was more real than the present. That's the way we're not supposed to think, and yet that is the way that I was raised to think. My grandmother's stories that she heard from her aunt about the period of the Civil War seemed to me were more real to me than the period that I was living through. It caused a major sort of twitch in identity that caused me from the very beginning to think as a Southerner, as a person defeated, that I would naturally have a sympathy with all the defeated of the world. That is to say, I was a folklorist before I'd ever heard the word folklore, before I could ever dream of imagining a profession for myself. I was identifying myself from the time that I was a tiny child with the defeated and oppressed. It would make me sympathetic to the Irish. It would make me sympathetic to African Americans. I dedicated very much of my life to civil rights work. I worked for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I was arrested all across the South, various kinds of demonstrations. And that was just a natural unfolding, no matter how ironic it seems, from having been raised by an old lady whose father was defeated in the American Civil War, fought in the Confederate cavalry, came home defeated, built a log cabin. And that was the first of sort of the first influence on me is my beautiful grandmother. She was amazingly beautiful, who just taught me about the past and caused me from that moment on to be fascinated by the proposition of history, but not history itself, but rather alternative histories, angry histories, histories of the subalterns, histories of the pissed off. That's the history that charmed me as a child, and it still does. The second important character in my life was my grandfather, who was a master carpenter, and who made miracles in the basement. I couldn't believe that you could drag in a bunch of old wood and turn it into tables, turn it into chairs, turn it into beautiful things. Put those things together, and you've got a material culture scholar who's 2 years old and has thought about already everything in life seems to be about alternative subaltern histories and the making of miracles out of common materials. Not goldsmithery, but you wonder why I'm drawn to pottery. It's precisely because it's made out of mud. It's made out of common material that costs absolutely nothing, and people can turn nothing into not only something, but something magnificent. I'm charmed and go everywhere looking for potters because of my grandfather. He was a great carpenter. I myself am a terrible carpenter, but I come about it honestly. The third character that invented me. Hi, John Luke. Third character that invented me was my father, who was very staunchly of the political left, which means that I never had to rebel. Saved me a whole lot of time. You know, having a father that had beaten the drum at the University of Virginia for the Communist Party was the thing that got me on the right track from the very beginning.
Right.
He volunteered on the day after Pearl Harbor to fight Hitler because he hated Hitler. He'd actually gone, he was so serious about this, that he'd gone in '39 over to Germany to see what was happening and come back with information for his local cell in New York City. Though he was from southern Louisiana, Franklin, Louisiana, for anybody who's local. He's from Franklin, Louisiana, but he hated the South like somebody out of Faulkner, hated the racism, hated everything the South stood for, and moved to New York. And hung out with left-wing Jews. It was his natural company, and good for him. But he went off to the war, leaving me with my grandmother. He came back with a great friend of his called S. Howard Lee. Steve Lee had been a professor of medieval literature at the University of Pennsylvania, but he was a collector of folk song. He had collected folk song from cowboys and deposited them in the archive in Washington, D.C. And every time that my father and his Navy cronies got together after the Second World War, Steve Lee was there with his guitar and singing songs. And so from the time that I was tiny, I had listened to folk song as performed by Steve Lee. And though that would be the third element, put them together, that's what you've got. You've got kind of a sympathy of identity having to do with defeat. You've got a lot of fascination with the way that people can turn worthless materials into beautiful objects, and the idea of folk song. That idea of folk song carried me through such that, hey Cece, yes, all right. Carried me through in such a way that when other kids in high school, I suppose, were listening to popular music, I never in my life listened to anything except folk music. Because from the time that I was maybe 3 or 4 years old, that was what music was to me. I mean, my father liked Burl Ives, for example, and by the time that I was, I don't know, probably 10 or 12 years old, it was only Leadbelly that I would listen to, and when Kenny Goldstein's records started to come out, particularly the child ballad records, I would say that in a sense, if you talk about how, when I first gave the name folklorist to the thing that I was becoming, it was the records that Kenny Goldstein edited. He was my hero. He remains my hero. I love Kenny. He directed my dissertation. But long before any Kenny Goldstein had ever appeared in my life as a human being, he was a little round, beautiful face at the back of those records. And he was telling me that, you know, that songs that my grandmother sang had child numbers. Now that's an interesting fact. And so that was very important to me. And that breakthrough moment, it's a kind of epiphany like, Stephen would have. It's an epiphany when I first heard the recording by Bascom Lamar Lunsford. What Lunsford did was to put together that Southern sympathy with the idea of folk song. Those things hadn't connected. It didn't make sense. You would think that they ought naturally to connect. When I was a tiny child, I had a grandmother who was literally singing child ballads. But I thought they were just lullabies to put you to sleep. She told stories of how Arna Thompson numbers. She was a country woman from the Piedmont of Virginia and had all the legitimacy in the world of being the kind of person that others would find a folk forward, but she was my grandmother. But there were these records, and the records were, the records had Leadbelly on them, and the records had Buell Kazee, and the records had these great monumental performers. And then there was Lunsford. And Lunsford sounded like my grandmother. He sounded, her younger brother Barry was a pretty good fiddler. He gave me my first lessons on the banjo. I never learned the damn thing, but he gave. Lunsford was an amazing thing to me. I guess I was about 15. And all of a sudden, something came together from my father's left-wing world of folk song with my grandmother's old-timey world of old-time Southernness. It was amazing to me. What did I do? Well, I went down to the Library of Congress where Mr. Lunsford had made a tremendous number of records. I met Ray Corson. I was 15, 16 years old. She was perfectly happy to give me the earphones so that I could listen to Bascom Lamar Lunsford. And I listened to everything that Lunsford put into that and vowed that that was what I was going to be. So that there I am, a high school student, and I'm already convinced that a folklorist is what I want to be. So that you wonder kind of the madness that I represent. That's what the madness is. I never thought I was going to be anything in the world but a folklorist. I just didn't know it had a name. Kenny Goldstein gave it a name by putting the notes in the back of the records. Bascom Lamar Lunsford brought it all together for me. And so that when I went off to college, thinking about how can you become a folklorist, I assumed medieval literature is what you did. That was the kind of associations that were made out of things like the child collection. I looked for medieval literature, so that was my dream. I would go to college, and I went to Tulane University right here. There was a man called Lumiansky, a very famous medievalist, who was teaching at Tulane, and that was part of my reason for being here. It wasn't nearly as big a part of the reason as the fact that the city of New Orleans was the environment for Tulane University, and I had been coming, my father being from southern Louisiana, I'd been coming to New Orleans for my whole life, and New Orleans meant exotic, it meant beautiful, it meant exciting, it meant art. And so that I was perfectly happy to come here. What's important, I know this is taking a long time, but I think this is the grounding that's necessary for my self-explanation, that these people all matter to me. And when I was an undergraduate, that is, as soon as I was an undergraduate, I began doing serious field work. As it wasn't something that I did later on, but by the time I was 20, I had a big tape recorder and I was going up into the mountains, and it never occurred to me that that was difficult. It never occurred to me that I wouldn't find ballad singers. It never occurred to me that I wouldn't find people that told me it, and it never occurred to me that I wouldn't find people that played fretless banjos. Therefore, of course, I found all those people. And I assume that if people would do that today, they still would find those people, but there's a kind of a sense that that's all belongs to the past. No one told me that. It belonged to the present, and I was up in the mountains, and I was immediately finding people who, some of whom were well known, Harbert Smith, one of the greatest of old-time banjo players ever, but Wes Sharp, of whom nobody's heard, Mac Presnell, a whole lot of other people welcomed me in and played their music for me and sang their ballads for me. Old Claude Prophet, no relation to Frank, was one of the great ballad singers of all time, and I recorded all those people, and it just seemed to me what I was really doing. I was going to college, you understand. But what I was really doing was I was already a boy field worker, and that's what was interesting to me. And I sought out guidance. First person I sought out for guidance was Bascom Lamar Lunsford. Mr. Lunsford lived in South Turkey Creek, North Carolina, Buncombe County, and he was perfectly gracious, and he welcomed me in, and I had my baby girl, and he blessed her, which is what I wanted. It's kind of secular blessing from Mr. Lunsford. And he said to me, "What are you going to do for our people?" And I said, "I'm going to study our people's architecture." He said, "Well, nobody's done that." And the reason that I could answer Mr. Lunsford like that, very simply, was the fact that I had already, by pure accident, met Fred Niffen, who was the person of all people that invented me. Mr. Niffen and I met by quite accident in the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York. And we were just standing there, both of us looking at an exhibit. And he said, "Kid, do you know what that thing is?" And I said, "Yes, sir, that's a fro that you use to split shingles." And he said to me within about 3 hours at that point, "Son, you could be the Francis James Child of vernacular architecture." What choice did I have? Here is the man who in 1937 wrote the most important article ever written on American vernacular architecture, Louisiana folk houses, and he's telling me that that's my destiny.
Wow.
And the reason for that is very simple. When I went up into the mountains, which I did, and was recording music, which I did, that was tended to be at night. People were farming during the day, and during the day, what was my interest? No one had told me that it would be interesting to study Appalachian architecture, but because I really am a terrible musician and have no musical skill whatsoever, but because I've got a relatively good eye and because I know about carpentry, I was studying the buildings. I didn't know that that was a legitimate activity. I didn't know that people did that, but me, I was doing it. So I was taking photographs, and by the time I met Fred Niffen, I had hundreds, maybe thousands of cheesy black and white photographs of log cabins and barns all over the Appalachian region. And so when Mr. Lunsford said to me, "What are you going to do for our people?" I could say to him, "I'm going to study our people's architecture." That's, I guess, to a great extent what I did. I searched for everybody, and I need to say these other people that helped me along. I went up to the mountains and met Richard Chase, the author of the Jack Tales, simply because I didn't know what else to do. You know, I wanted to meet people that knew about folklore, and that's what I did. Is I just went up, and Uncle Dick was perfectly welcoming to me and helpful. Most important among those people that helped me in field work was Paul Clayton. And Clayton has kind of gotten somehow submerged in the history of the folk song revival. I understand why Bob Dylan avoids the topic in his autobiography, but that's because he's a deceptive egomaniac. Paul Clayton basically pulled Bob Dylan out of nothing, shaped his career, and put him on the road. And Paul Clayton was exciting to me for the fact that he was a folk singer, but he did field work, and that was just about unique. John Cohen, even a few other people, you know. But Paul Clayton, in order to make his records bloody ballads or whatever they were, actually went out into the field and met new people, and I thought that was exhilarating. What excited me about Paul Clayton was not his sweet baritone voice, or his excellent guitar playing, or his songwriting. He wrote "Gotta Travel On," but rather the fact that he really did field work. And Clayton had done a magnificent project with Mrs. McAllister there in Browns Cove, Virginia, and Clayton was really more than any more obvious academic folklorist, my model for how to go about doing the kind of field work that was exciting to me. And what I wanted to do was just what he did with Mrs. McAllister, and I did it. I began the first project with Tab Ward in Beach Creek and later Ola Belle Reed. Same kind of work, that is recording every song they knew, asking them what the meanings of those songs were. It was always interesting to me to be rigorous empirically, and that was also, I think, a great gift to me. I'm not being particularly coordinated in this rant, but you get the picture. That Fred Niffen came in from the discipline of geography and gave me a model of empirical order, which is, don't want to be mean, but it's a little bit superior to the one that normally is used in folklore. It made me think about quantities as well as qualities. It made me think about ordering principles, and it's something that I've held to my breast ever since. From folklore, I loved the idea of exact and precise recording. And I put together the kind of quantitative methods of geography with the qualitative methods of folklore. And that's what bore me forward. Maybe I'm continuing to talk too much. Maybe I've been built in this story. But at any rate, I've just brought myself up to that very point that I'm still an undergraduate. At that point, I'd published a fair number of articles in scholarly folklore journals. Wasn't hard, isn't hard. And I was ready to go to graduate school. So I just take this minute more. And I really had only one choice, which was the University of Pennsylvania, because I'd read a review that Dorson wrote of a book by Ben Botkin, and I said, I certainly don't want to be a student with a man that mean. And so I went off to the University of Pennsylvania. I suppose maybe that's enough of this kind of stuff. Have I been created?
That's good stuff. That's all good stuff.
Do you want to come up here and stand with me?
I suppose.
Well, why not?
Okay. Hey, Henry.
Hey.
Well, you know, you kind of got a lot in there, and a lot of my follow-up questions have been answered. Let me just think about. Let's call it your American phase, which isn't to say no. I mean, Tim and I have a bet as to how many questions I'm going to get in. You're answering them.
I stopped prematurely and at random just so that they all break and ask.
I appreciate it. As I'm here. I'm going to think about your American period. I'm talking about from sort of boy folklore field worker through your graduate training up through state folklorist Pennsylvania, first in at Indiana. I'm talking about the era of the pattern book, of the folk housing in Middle Virginia book. I'm going to call that your American phase, which is not to say that your American phase is over. One of the things is about Henry is that he's kind of agglutinating in his style. He has a phase, but then he adds another one, and then another one. It's not like he's stopped doing American stuff. Anyway, I'm talking too much now.
No.
It's catching. Anyway, one of the things that comes through in this phase is an interest in democratizing the historical record. That's definitely, you're talking about subaltern histories, the histories of the pissed off. I'm wondering what else compels you during this period. Is it the idea of America? Do you want to make a place for material culture in folklore? What other sorts of things? And of course I have follow-up questions. But just say a little bit more about the American phase before we, and I don't want to let chronology push us around too much, but I want to start there.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Jill asked me, we were talking, and she said, since I was living in New Orleans, I must therefore have been paying attention to New Orleans. Actually, I was living in New Orleans, and when I was living here, I was doing all of my fieldwork in Mississippi and Alabama. That doesn't make sense, New Orleans being so exciting. No, to me it makes perfect sense. Nobody's studying Mississippi and Alabama as much, whereas Jill is, but at any rate. not the same intensity at that time as say New Orleans. I mean, already I read Gumbo Yaya, New Orleans seemed to be framed up, but Mississippi and Alabama seemed to be missing, and so I was over there all the time. That doesn't seem to have much to do with what Ray asked me, but it's exactly that, because I had a pickup truck, and once I'd met Fred Niffen, that he lived in Baton Rouge, which is just northwest up the road, and what we would do is every maybe 2 months, we would meet and plan out what was the next project. And we had a map the size of that wall of the southern United States. And we were really going into different territories. He said, you've got to do the Washington Mountains, I'm doing the Washington Mountains, do Franklin County, Alabama, do Franklin County, Alabama. And so we were both going to different places, and our goal was ultimately to have looked at the landscape, not just the buildings, but the buildings are central to the landscape, to look at the landscape of the entire eastern United States. Fred Niffen wrote a couple of tremendously important articles, Folk Housing Key to Diffusion being his work. And all I was doing, because remember now I'm an undergraduate still, all I dreamed of doing was exactly the kind of work that Fred Niffen did. I didn't want to do anything different. I wanted to do that kind of work and to do it well. That is to say, I had a master, I was an apprentice. I'm going to work in his vein. I had no desire to be a revolutionary. I simply wanted to do Niffen-style geographic work. It meant that when things like Meinig's book on the landscape was put out, that I was the one person, not a geographer, who was included in the circle of geographers. At that point, all the way from the time I was a freshman through graduate school, I was constantly on the road. I made it my business to get into every county in the eastern United States. Not that I got into every one for a long time, but I at least drove through it and got a sense. And I was accumulating information, and my vision then, that's the vision that lies behind the book, Pattern and Material, Folk Culture of the Eastern United States. A funny book, but anyway, all I wanted to do was to do Niffen's work. But my goal was just what Ray said. My goal was that folklorists hadn't paid attention to material culture, and that was my goal. And so that I was operating overtly, even proudly in the frame of the historic geographic method, and proving that, which was, I think, absolutely true, a thing that Warren Roberts, my dear departing colleagues, argued, is that if you don't believe in the historic geographic methods because you're using the wrong materials, you're trying to get it out of oral literature, you can't do it. But you can certainly do it with material culture because it's actually old.
Yeah.
It's not sort of dreamed of as old. If you put archaeology together with modern material culture study, you can do all those historic geographic jobs that all those Finns wanted us to do with folktales. Hey, Joe. Literally all I wanted initially to do was to prove to the discipline of folklore that material culture mattered. In the book that was Folk Housing in Middle Virginia, it was written with no goal other than that. It has a curious moment of genesis that I'm going to take a second with, because this is the record or something.
Yeah.
I went to Middle Virginia in order to record the life story of an elderly African-American gentleman called Otis Banks. The reason I wanted to do that is that I recorded entirely the life story of my grandmother. And they were exactly the same age. An old white woman and an old African-American man. Their culture was the same. That was a position I was taking. It was a political position. And I wanted to undermine a lot of feelings in the United States by having a white woman and a black man married effectively. I was in my mind marrying Mr. Banks to my grandmother because they were from exactly the same place, they were from exactly the same social class. They were hard-working, small farmers from the Piedmont of Virginia. And so I proposed my project to Mr. Banks. I'd met him because he was still using mules to plow with, and he interested me agriculturally, and he said he'd love to do that project. And then young African-American men said it was not a good idea to be hanging around with this white guy. And they disrupted my project. It was heartbreaking for me. Heartbreaking for Mr. Banks, maybe even more. So then what I do, I turn around, well, I got some good buildings here in the same area. So I started making a survey of the buildings. And when I was that was ultimately folk housing in Middle Virginia. But when I was surveying those buildings, there was a wonderful house that was built in about 1770 by a guy called Sam Dabney. It was completely covered with poison ivy. I had to think, is this a good idea or not? I gotta make a floor plan, so I break through the window and I go inside and I make the floor plan, and I came out with a case of poison ivy that was gonna kill me. And so my lung was filled with poison ivy. I had to be taken to the University of Virginia Hospital. And when I was recuperating, I said, now what am I gonna do with my time? I said, I'm gonna write an essay for folklorists to convince them to study material culture, and that's pattern of material culture. It started with me using with poison ivy in a tent in, I like the pronunciation, Orchard, Virginia. That's exactly how that began. So anyway, I never did the project with my grandmother and Mr. Banks, but I did ultimately continue the project of surveying that area. So that there's two completely different interests in effect occurred at the same moment. The first interest is I'm trying to convince folklorists that material culture is worthy of study. But then studying a very tiny area effectively in the framework of pattern of material culture and writing the book Folk Housing in Middle Virginia, I convinced myself of the importance of history. It wasn't because I was interested from my grandmother in a kind of sentimental history, but what the buildings did was no matter how hard I tried to reduce those to evidence of Piedmont personality. That's the influence from Cyril Fox, that's the influence from Eston Evans, that's the influence from Yorworth Pete. Whole group of folkloristically inflected cultural geographers had taught me that the personality of the landscape is a worthy project. All I wanted to do was to write the personality of Piedmont, Virginia from its architecture, but the buildings kept saying, we're built at different times. You can't synchronize us into a unit that represents a cultural whole. Instead, we represent layers of time. And as soon as I got that picture, then really it was the buildings themselves that taught me to work on the historical project that you talked about. And so those things, all those projects were done, that is the folk housing book came out of the research that was done at the same time as the pattern book, and that would be roughly 1967. I still didn't have a PhD, but I was working real hard because I love field work. I mean, that's the simplest thing. You know, ladies and gentlemen, you can go home. Really, I like to do field work. And so that was just it. I mean, I'm going to be there, I'm going to be doing field work. If I can't talk to this wonderful African-American man, well, I'll measure houses. If the houses wouldn't let me measure them, I'd do something else. I want to be in the field. So, but those two moves are two moves within material culture that characterize what you were calling the American phase. And that's exactly right. That my first interest was to convince folklorists of the value of material culture for writing the pattern book. But then I taught myself, shocked myself. I taught myself history by writing the folk housing book. And then all of a sudden I found myself in collusion with a whole different range of people. That is to say, maybe this is a little bit funny to say briefly. Every book I've written for folklorists. I don't think generally folklorists have given a damn. But there's been somebody real interested in those things, so that the geographers, when the pattern book, for example, is 25 years old, had panels on it at the American Geographical Society. And folk housing in Middle Virginia was embraced by archaeologists in a way that was almost shocking. And so that all of a sudden I had a whole range of friends in archaeology, in particular Jim Dietz. And so that's the human being that I would lift up to create as a kind of symbol of that whole move. That Jim and I then became closest colleagues, in the sense, not speaking only of affection, but thinking about working on exactly the same issues. And so from then on until Jim died, I mean, I talked to him about an hour before he died. And we were amazingly close, but it was because we were always working on the same projects. And we were always interested in dovetailing field data with archaeological data in order to create, and the term which I put in that is taken straight from Claude Lévi-Strauss. to write a more democratic history, which is the mission of anthropology. And the mission of folklore, it seems to me, one of the major missions is to write a more democratic history. And what I found was that while it's a little bit difficult to do that out of oral history, and it's very difficult to do it out of oral literature, it's really easy to do out of material culture. There's the writing of an alternative history is fairly easy done if you measure several thousand times.
Once you reach that stage in your career, you've either borrowed certain tools or built your own tools, and you can really kind of take that style of scholarship, you can really kind of take it anywhere. Did you think at this time that America would sustain your scholarly attention for the rest of your career? Or did you already have your eye on the horizon toward working with cultures you didn't grow up with?
It's interesting what we imagine ourselves to be, but if I were to go back and recapture that child that has just, I can remember standing in the student union at Tulane with an article that I'd written that had just been published, and here I'm an undergraduate. I was so happy. It was called The Appalachian Log Cabin. I received a letter from the great Jesse Stewart, great Kentucky poet, saying what a wonderful article it was. There I am full of pride, and I met a friend of mine called Louis Schell, who was a graduate student in math, and he said, who the hell would write something like log cabins? It's stupid. Yes. So that was, so I'm imagining that child at that moment. What did I think I was going to get out of graduate school? I thought that out of graduate school, I was going to get a job as a high school English teacher in some Appalachian county. It never occurred to me that I'd get a job teaching in the university. It just didn't seem possible. It seemed beyond the university professors were not me. And that, you know, now we complain about the lack of jobs, but then there were no jobs there was no such thing as a job. So I never occurred to me that I was going to teach folklore in graduate school. It occurred to me that I was going to teach English literature, which I could do, and all I wanted was a location in some Appalachian county. I was hoping for East Tennessee, which is just so beautiful. You know, in Elizabethton or near Bristol or something. That was what I dreamed of doing. And so that's an answer to your question. Did I think about going other places? No. Not only was I interested in America, I really thought the American South was big enough. And when I was, let's say, a senior in college, I could array for you very easily what my influences were. In folklore, Vance Randolph, George Corson, Leonard Roberts. They all dug deep in one place. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. I had read, because I was an anthropology student, I had read Robert Lowy's The Crow Indians. The book blew my brain almost as much as King Lear did the first time I read it. This is what I want to do. I wanted to write The Crow Indians for some Tennessee county. That is, to study everything, not some things. And so that was exactly my vision. So did I have a vision beyond America? Not at all. So it never occurred to me that I was going to go to Ireland, or for heaven's sake, Turkey. Where in the world is Turkey? I felt like I was really doing something almost naughty to go north of Pennsylvania. This is true. So no, I didn't have any vision whatsoever of doing anything international. It was not at all in my frame. If there were any place that was international, now you've got to imagine me having graduated and in fact not finding myself teaching high school in some small Tennessee county, but rather teaching at Indiana University with that very same Dorset. I know this is ridiculous to say, but I always thought that I would teach at Indiana once I got thinking about that, because I would go to Penn and I would teach at Indiana, and that would be logical. I liked Dorset a great deal. I just didn't want to meet Dorset as an inferior. I wanted to meet him as an equal, and I found that he welcomed me as an equal and was a wonderful boss. I'm quite fond of Richard Dorset. I think he has a kind of a bad rap. People picture him as a kind of rightist monster. But he was a sort of Hubert Humphrey style liberal, and a good guy and a great person to work with for me. So then if I'm a little bit older, then I could imagine myself going one place and did, and it was the same place that you've gone, but maybe not exactly for the same reasons. I had met E. Eston Evans. One of the, I mean, you can't, I'm standing, these are the people that invented me, Fred Niffen. How could I wouldn't even exist without Fred Niffen. I just wouldn't exist. I wouldn't be here. If it weren't for Paul Clayton, I wouldn't be here. If it weren't for Baskin Lunsford, I wouldn't be. If it weren't for Kenny Goldsmith, I just wouldn't exist. I would just be kind of a nubba thing. I'd be the wax that spills from a candle, I'd be a nothingness. Eston Evans is one of those people. He was a great friend of Fred Niffen, a professional geographer, and he came to give a lecture at Louisiana State University, and I went up there and I met Prof. Evans. And Evans wrote Irish folkways. He wrote Irish heritage. He wrote Mourne Country. If anybody hasn't read Mourne Country, that's the thing for you to do this weekend. One of the great local studies ever done in the history of the discipline of folklore. Just wonderful. Right from the geology and the climate straight on through to how to build a house and sing a song. It was just a wonderful model of research. And so Eston Evans was a thrilling presence. I mean, a gentleman in the proper sense, gentle in a man. Handsome, tall, elegant, articulate, great writer. And his book, The Personality of Ireland, really has no match in world literature for being able to capture a single country in a small compass. Unbelievable. You read that book, it's about 170 pages long. At the end of it, you know everything you really need to know about Ireland. It's unbelievable. So I met Eston Evans, and so he would be an inspiration for me, obviously, to go to Ireland. The bigger inspiration for me to go to Ireland was Irish literature. And I didn't necessarily think that meeting Evans or loving Irish literature was going to take me to Ireland. But nonetheless, that's there. That story is also simply told in high school. I found that people were reading, my friends were reading Catcher in the Rye. There used to be this thing, reading, but they were reading Catcher in the Rye, and I said, who would want to read a book about a prick like that? You know, terrible boy, of no interest to me whatsoever. And so but I found Sean O'Casey's autobiography. I'm probably 14, 15 years old. Unbelievable. There's a person like I can identify with. A person with political motives, red and green all together, person poor boy from the slums of Dublin. And I loved Sean O'Casey's autobiography. I knocked at the door. It was for me what Catcher in the Rye were for other kids. And it just caught me up, and I said, well, this is a great man. And so I started reading about O'Casey. O'Casey led me to Yeats, obviously. And then I still recall I was too young to drive an automobile, so it must have been under 16. At least in the place I was, the second you were 16, you already owned the car, you already knew how to drive it, you just hit the road. But I walked into a kind of a ratty bookstore on 9th Street in Washington, D.C., and I found Two Tales of Shem and Sean. That is a fascicle from Finnegan's Wake. I said, this Joyce guy, I've heard of him. All I'm saying is that Sean O'Casey's I Knock at the Door, Two Tales of Shem and Sean, caught me up in Ireland. But it was the literature that I loved. I mean, I loved Prof. Evans and so on. So that then whenever it seemed logical that I would be able to apply for a grant that would take me to a foreign country, it's to Ireland I wanted to go. I made it a kind of excuse. It only takes a second. I made a kind of excuse because obviously from Northern Ireland came the populace of the Appalachian realm, and the Appalachian realm was my commitment. But really that was less moving to me than the fact that how could a nation with a population smaller than Philadelphia's have produced, you start the list and it blows your mind. Yeats, Patty Cavanaugh, O'Casey, Seamus Heaney, James Joyce, Flann O'Brien. Something's going on there, and it wasn't something to do with genius any more than Florence in 1500 was. Something amazing was happening socially in the Ireland of the 20th century that was like what was happening in the Italy of the 16th century. And I wanted to be there. So then I applied to the nice Guggenheim people, they gave me some money and I went. Not the end of the American phase, because I've always taught American vernacular. the last thing that I've written was a little screed about the need for vernacular architecture study in historic preservation. So that's still a major interest.
So you're in Ireland now?
I am.
You're Irish.
Just grand.
You've gone there because of the evidence, also the literature, also the perhaps some comparative
Yes.
leverage on the Appalachian situation. But the comparative thing isn't what comes out in the 4 books that you've written about that. I mean, what hooks you while you're there? And I guess as long as I'm interrupting, I'm up here. You've spoken movingly in class about how Ireland shaped you, and you know your teachers everywhere shaped you. But I would like to know at some work into this at some point. How did the individuals that you became apprenticed to shape you, not just as a folklorist, but as a person? So let's just start with, once you get to Ireland, what's the hook? Is it what you expected? What compels you during this phase?
To the Guggenheim Foundation, I said that I wanted to go to Ireland because I would be able to study an architectural range in Ireland that would be parallel to the Virginia range. That was true, absolutely true. In other words, it was a rare thing in our business, a hypothetical deductive test, and it worked absolutely. But as I said, that it had to be the case that in Ireland around 1900, there would be an architectural revolution comparable to Virginia's around 1760. That is, in about 15 years before the rebellion against England, that rebellion would be announced in the way that people rearrange their domestic environments. That's now carried me not only to Ireland, I've followed that argument all the way to Bangladesh, and it's true. It's true. That is, before change registers in the realm of politics, it registers in the intimate realm of the domestic environment. If you know how to study the way people range their domestic worlds, you can predict major cultural changes. That's true. I went to Ireland that was an exciting enough idea that at least at that time I was the youngest person ever to have a Guggenheim.
Wow.
And that idea was exciting enough to get me there. Well, I tested it and I did write it up, and it is true. But really what I wanted to do was something very different. When I was reading, as an anthropology student, when I was reading the writings of Robert Lowy, I was also reading Oscar Lewis. I greatly admire Oscar. Oscar comes from, he came from the same end of the political spectrum that I do. And he had the same kind of sympathies for the peasantry that I do. And so I really was thinking about Oscar Lewis. I was thinking about his Tepoztlán Studied. I was thinking about Pedro Martinez. I was thinking of the Sanchez family. I wanted to, in fact, in my heart, do that kind of a study in Ireland. I didn't really want to do a study of architecture, but that I knew perfectly well that I could do that pretty quickly, and I could. But what I really wanted to do was to settle in. And when I settled in, then I began to have the people began to rise around me. I think of John Montague's wonderful poem that like dolmens around me, the old people, they rise in gray shadow. And that's exactly the people that I met in Ireland. The very first day that I chose the place that I was going to study Ballymanon only because it was beautiful. I chose it because the farming was good, and therefore if people kept their farms up, guess what? They're going to keep everything else up. If the hedges are clean, that's going to be a good place. It's going to be a place for decent neighbors, think of rubber cross. So first day I was there, I didn't know anybody there, had absolutely no leads, I'd asked nobody's permission and never have. I just walked up to about the first house that was there, and who was that? Peter Flanagan standing in front of me in terror. Rosary before his breast. Who is this person? Later on I asked him, I said, what did you think? He said, I was terrified. He said, I assumed that you were a Scottish spy. This is, maybe I neglect to say this is 1972, the bloodiest years.
Yes.
The trouble is, this is the year that Bloody Sunday happened. This is the year that more people were killed in Northern Ireland than any other year. That's the year that I chose to be there, very much on purpose. I walked up to Peter, and he said, you told me you were an American, but you don't have an American accent. People who go from that part of Ireland to America end up in the Bronx.
Yes.
So clearly I'm a Scot. I mean, it's not Irish, and it's not English, it's something else, must be Scotch. So he just thought, but at any rate, Peter Flanagan became one of those people. I loved Peter Flanagan. I absolutely loved him. It's one of those things that we find in ethnography that you're supposed to honor the people. The one thing that Peter said never to do was to put his age in the book. And I never did. You know, the other people want other things, but Peter was wonderfully and magnificently vain, and just simply wouldn't allow the fact that he was born in 1906 to be my book, because he insisted that we were equals.
Yeah.
And Peter, for example, hated to be used as a folklore informant. You know, we say, well, we don't want to use the word informant. It upset him too. Not the word informant, the very proposition.
Yeah.
And I had to make a deal with Peter, with whom I ultimately lived. Peter and his old brother Joe, and I had you know, their house was about the size of this room, and I had a black hole in it that was filthy and so on. But we made a deal. After Sunday dinner, I could turn the tape recorder on for an hour. That wouldn't have been very good, except if I stayed there for several years, which I did. Then it was okay. I mean, I got plenty of information from Peter. But Hugh Nolan was exactly the opposite, and the two of them, they really, I'm sprung between them as a nothingness, between these two magnificent human beings. And Hugh Nolan was the most calm and philosophical person I think that I've ever met. And I use Hugh Nolan constantly. I employ him, I guess I exploit him. But the fact is, no one was, not even Kenny, a greater teacher than me than Hugh Nolan was. The kind of calm and decency that he would have in approaching any problem in the world, that's exactly the perfect liberal consciousness was in the mind of Hugh Nolan. And Peter didn't have a perfect liberal consciousness. He was emotion itself. And between the two of them, they became among the greatest people that I've ever known. And so those two people, you've asked me a question and I haven't forgotten it, but they have to be the people who are doing this teaching. What do you learn? The first thing that you're let's say I'm setting out as an ethnographer. I've read Oscar Lewis and I've read a lot of Native American ethnographies, and I'm applying the kind of Mexican Native American principles to the study of somebody in Ireland. I've read, you know, Connie Ahrensberg and so on, but I wasn't moved by that particularly. I like the poets. I mean, Paddy Kavanagh's Terry Flynn will tell you what Irish country life is really, really like, or the Great Hunger if you have the courage for it. But Great Hunger fundamentally says that Irish rural life is about masturbation, and you know, that's getting close to something that we don't normally talk about. But these guys had a truth for me. And what was that truth? Religion. My kind of secular anthropological background, hello, all right, just didn't prepare me. Just didn't prepare me for the way that a philosophy could be developed by an individual out of a formal religious matrix. But that's exactly what Hugh Nolan and Peter Flanagan have both done. And that was a wonderful shock, because of you can see the way that the liberal secular ideology is built into almost the very foundations of the disciplines of folklore anthropology. And so that you can be ready for some things. You can be ready for difference and equality. I mean, below. But are you ready for the truth? I wasn't. But that's really, really, really what I learned by spending 10 years in the midst of the bombs were going off at night. People were being murdered. The local school teacher was machine gunned in front of his class. You were constantly stopped by British soldiers who were not necessarily too frightening and too bad, but there were Protestant thugs on the road that scared the Jesus out of them. Just the truth. I wasn't afraid of the Irish Republican Army boys. They made mistakes, but they were courteous. But there were other people who were abroad in the land. I was hanging out. I mean, when the police came into my house and turned it completely upside down in the middle of the winter, I had my kids with me, and 3 children thrown out in. They assumed that because the people I was hanging out with, that's not a bad assumption, but the people that I was hanging out with, that I must have been a gun runner from the United States. They read all my field notes and so on, and were really bully boys. It was a very unattractive event. The kids crying, and winter, they're outside, it's raining, what's going on here? So that was that's the scene. In the middle of it, these old gentlemen are thinking through propositions of existence that are not just in relationship to the trivial context, important, but are in relationship to the profoundest rules that govern the universe. Really important for me to learn. If I were to carry that forward, and I'm not going to preempt your other questions, but that was the great learning. That was not a thing that my father, who had a Marxist view of religion, would ever have taught me. And my grandmother, who did go to church, in fact played the pump organ in a little white frame church, still for her it was songs about being in the arms of sweet Jesus, which was attractive, I'm sure, to her, but didn't tell me much.
Yeah.
I respected it, but I didn't understand it. So that in a way, the whole proposition of the sacred was just something that was new to me. Social orders are not new to me, all these kind of things that anthropologists are concerned about, things that I was studying. Kinship, I did kinship charts of every single person in the community. I did all those studies of dyadic relations. I found out who really loaned tools to who, but all those other things that all that reading about Mexican ethnography taught me to pay attention to, but nobody has really readied me for the way that these people endured is because they had faith. It didn't quite exist in my paradigm. It existed maybe somehow in my vocabulary, but not in my paradigm. What can I say? The next big stop for me was Turkey, and I was ready for faith. And it was just so, talk about it, it's empirical training. One study trains for the next. And so that when I hit Turkey, that I began to hear all these quotations from Mevlana. Gal, whoever you are, whatever you've done, you're welcome in the portals of faith. And most of the artisans that were my dearest friends in Turkey were all followers of, not followers of Sufi orders, but they quoted Samurai and they quoted Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi. And there was the basis for life lay in this vision of the sacred. Then I hit Bangladesh. I said, what an opportunity. This is a Muslim nation, but it's got a high Hindu minority. I turned because, of course, they are the subject people. Obviously, they're the people who are going to attract me. Got to know Hinduism. Then I said, what did I best do? This was utterly self-conscious. I've been having an experience of Buddhism. Went off to Japan. Ultimately, I would come out of this with a simple statement, but it's one that's been tremendously beneficial to me, even though I've been interested from the very beginning in gathering empirical evidence and framing it up in such a way as to make it comparable. It goes all the way back to Nick. Recording particular instances of empirical evidence with great exactness. That's a gift from folklore. Both of those things come to me. And it's tremendously important. But then I've felt that the only way that I can really get into the deep fissures of the philosophy of the people that I'm working with is probably through the sacred. And it's a rattling experience for a secular type guy like me. And so the wonderful experience, I went to Japan and I spent time with people who made statues for home altars of Buddhist worship. That was great. What an exciting time I had with Twin 77 to study a religion that's not counted as one of the great religions of the world, the Oracle religion, given its impact on Cuba and Brazil and Trinidad, maybe ought to be counted a great world religion. But it operates on different principles. So in a way, philosophically, we've had experiences, deep experiences in the field with polytheistic and monotheistic thought. Levi-Strauss would say that the radical opposites of those possibilities are India and Islam. How wonderful to have spent all that time in Turkey. A whole decade I had to get to know Islam. A whole decade to get to know Hinduism. Wonderful. Praveen and I travel around India. I worshipped at all those altars. It's not hypocritical because I believe in what it means to those people, having nothing to do with me. I'm, like I say, I repeat it, kind of an emptiness, but this emptiness is witness to how profound that is, and so that we can categorize it as an interest in belief or an interest in religion. But that's not the way it operates for me. For me, it's an interest in the philosophical precepts of the people who occupy my attention. And almost always those are framed up, even if the people themselves are not religious, that's the materials they have to create argument. And so if I were to ignore religiosity, I wouldn't be able to get deep information from almost everybody I've worked with. Well, that's what I learned in Ireland. I mean, really, there are a whole lot of other things I learned in these other places, so I don't want to over-talk this thing. But it was really because Hugh Nolan got up on Sunday, and he was in his 80s, and he still pedaled his bike to Mass in time. Then he'd pedal his bike to Mass in Enniskillen, and he was a believer. But he never proselytized or pushed anything around. It was just being able to listen to somebody who didn't even go to primary school, who could talk with me at the highest levels of abstraction and the deepest levels of sympathy. What the hell's, my PhD is pretty, I guess. But it doesn't, all it did, all my learning, all my reading, I mean, I'm a mad reader, that's another part of at least my story. All it did was to make me capable of understanding what you know and was teaching me. Wonderful.
Another question?
Yeah.
Well, the centrality of the sacred is actually a much better segue to getting us to Turkey than what I had anticipated.
That's all
But there's
right.
another thing that's getting you to Turkey. It
Yeah.
seems to me
Yeah.
that your work has revolved around the poles of art and history, and sometimes at the same time. But where we're going here, I think it's safe to say that you shift back toward the topic of art when you re-enter the debate over the nature of folk art with the spirit of folk art and with the Turkish book and the book from Bangladesh. So it might be a little artificial to talk about your Turkish phase and your Bangladeshi phase because there are connections between those two. But let's talk about Turkey. This is a massive project that requires learning a whole new language. And at some point, I'd like to think about the difference in scale between the different projects. Maybe we do that toward the end after we've sort of gotten through them. But let's talk about Turkey. Say more about what took you there in the first place,
Yeah, absolutely.
and then what compels you once you're there.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, this has to do with the history of folklore, and it's a thing about which we, I think, ought to be slightly more self-conscious, and that is that as soon as there was a folk arts panel at the National Endowment for the Arts, there was a major alteration created throughout the discipline. Yesterday, there was sort of talk that folklore is inevitably about aesthetics. That wasn't true before that moment. That's really the consequence of there being grant money available for folklorists. Folklorists are kind of poverty-stricken lot. They never had gotten grant money before. I mean, we talked about that when I was in school. It never occurred to me that I would apply for a grant. Or, here's Raj Abrams said the greatest folklorist of our time was Kenneth S. Goldstein. I think I agree. Kenny never had a grant ever for anything. Just did his work. So the grant money intrudes in an interesting way. And what happened in the little world of the folklore discipline is that when there was money available from the National Endowment for the Arts for folklorists to get money to do things, suddenly everybody was talking about folk art a lot. And they hadn't been talking about folk art before that much. And what also was interesting to me is a great many people began to talk about folk art that didn't know much about folk art, even though they were folklorists. And so there was a kind of a residual effect. That is, a lot of folklorists who hadn't cared much about material culture suddenly started caring about material culture because there was a little bit of money. And I'm not saying this is totally cynical, but that is more or less what happened. And so there were several conferences that were held about the nature of folk art in the early period of the National Endowment for Arts dabbling in folk art. And one of them was at Winterthur, and Winterthur was a very violent meeting. Elaine F. was involved in that meeting. Elaine's here at these meetings. And then there was one in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress that was, again, this sort of debate over what is folk art, and really the idea of trying to separate folk art out as a separate category from the things of the world had a great deal to do with the desire by folklorists to claim this material for their own. John Blatch was very much a part of these arguments. And it was in that context that I chanced, this is part of the answer to your story, that I chanced into Turkey. I had been a part of those arguments, maybe less strident than John Blatch, but nonetheless striking a position that folklorists owned the topic of folk art. And it was ultimately the case that Charlene Cerny, who had been at one of those meetings, said to me, I noticed that your ideas are being stolen by other people. And particularly a guy called Ken Ames, who wrote a book that was just 100% plagiarism. You know, I was invited down to Winter in order to talk to the staff about what folk art was. Ames took notes and wrote it up into a book before, not, I guess it's okay to say that. He probably would disagree, but it's what I'm not saying he didn't add a fillip or two or a metaphor that I hadn't, but some of the metaphors were mine. But I didn't care about that particularly much, to tell you the truth. But Charlene said that you ought to get your position down on paper. So she got money from Mr. Marcus of the Neiman Marcus Company, a lovely guy, completely wonderful man. And so he paid me to come over to New Mexico and spend the summer writing the book, The Spirit of Folk Art, so as to, in Charlene's words, to get this folk art story down. But really, that wasn't what was compelling me. What was compelling me is that the problem of American folk art was tangled up effectively in the antique market, and you couldn't really extract it. And my father was always ran an antique shop, so I come by that interest. I'm very interested in the antique market as a thing in itself. And the antique market caused a kind of distortion, in my opinion, of what the idea of folk art was. During all these arguments, I gave, for example, a talk about what is folk art at the Whitney Museum of Art, and I included an Easter cake that was made by an Italian family in South Philadelphia. It's ephemeral stuff. How can that be folk art? How can you possibly sell an Easter cake, you know? And that was of course, that was my very point. Well, I seem not to be making much sense at this point, but there was an argument over the nature of folk art, and I thought that the problem of American folk art that was so wrapped up to some extent in American patriotism, and particularly in the American antique market, that if I would just go to a completely other place that had no connection with American patriotism and no connection to the American antique market, and just try to look at folk art plain, I would really understand it. And that wasn't the only motive, that was one of the motives for going to Turkey. That is, I was invited to Turkey. These things do tie together a little bit more efficiently than they ought to. I went to Turkey because of the fact that I wrote this book, Folk Housing in Middle Virginia, when I had all this poison ivy oozing out here. I wrote the book, Folk Housing in Middle Virginia. It was found by a couple of Turkish architects. And they had a very serious problem, which was the designing of housing for the urban poor. And they realized that instead of looking at buildings as being just plans and facades, looking at buildings as disassemblable, transformable principles, that maybe those principles could be picked out of rural architecture and applied to urban dwellings for the poor. They invited me to come to the Middle East Technical University in Ankara to meet with them and to visit the houses of poor folks. They lived in things called gecekondu. To visit gecekondu people, then to go out into the countryside, which we did, into villages, and they asked me how would I apply the principles that I'd worked out in folk housing in Middle Virginia to this serious urban problem. I'd already been doing that because when I was teaching at Penn, I had a joint appointment in the School of Architecture, and we'd already been doing problems exactly like that, studying studying the need for non-private spaces among African American people who recently moved from the South. And then these kids are on the corner. Of course they're on the corner. They'd be on the corner home. You need to design into the urban environments places where people can claim external space for their own. That was actually the solution, ultimately the problem of designing for the poor in Turkey. The problem was, we visited villages, it was a cinch. If men are now entered the capitalistic market for bodies and are taken away from the home all day long, what do the women do? In Turkish villages, women gather in a big group. It's wonderful. They're outside. They all leave their homes. They gather in some shady place. They knit, they spin, they do handcrafts, they talk with each other. They all care for all the babies. And if you come from that, you've lived that way your whole life, and suddenly you're dropped into Ankara, Izmir, or Istanbul in an apartment house, you feel close to suicide. Exactly the truth. At any rate, that's what, so that there were principles that you could extract from village architecture and apply to high-rise housing in Turkey. And that was the thing that took me to Turkey. However, once I got there, I started looking around. And some of you might have endured that little bit of talk yesterday, but I showed a couple of pictures from Turkey, but I've spent years there. But that's a place where, I mean, people still use the pots that were made by hand. All these kind of things that really felt like they belonged to the 19th century, or in particular, it was a particular kind of slipped and combed ware that looked like stuff from England from about 1770s for sale in the markets in Istanbul for like 35 cents. It was still being done. I mean, not a little bit, thousands of people. So that was what excited me. That it seemed to me that I could go to Turkey, and one of the things that I'd be able to see is in place, on the ground, in reality, before my eyes, all the principles that were being dreamed up by the theorists of folk art and applied back into 19th century situations. So that wasn't honestly the only reason for my wanting to go to Turkey, but I think it's one that relates to the discipline and the discipline's problem. That one of the excitements that I had in being in Turkey was that I felt like I understood folk art. Instead of understanding rules that I could apply or looking at things and trying to dream up stuff, I could talk to the people. I mean, talk not to a few people, but thousands of people. And so that was one of my purposes. To be clear, it wouldn't have been enough to sustain me. Because you say it was a hard project, it really is. I mean, I was 40 years old. I didn't hardly know where Turkey was. You know, and to get to be able to speak the language well enough to interview people, it's hard stuff. And to learn the whole history of a different civilization, I mean, it makes me talk about alternative histories. I mean, I'm just amazed at people that know about the Ottoman Empire. You know, people are paying attention to little kind of grotesque peripheral activities in France and Spain. The Ottoman Empire is ruling the world. You know, Greeks in Rome we care about it, but when the Ottomans, Turks do it, it doesn't seem to be so. That's kind of too off the project. But what is true is that I had to learn a whole new language. I had to learn a whole new religion. I've read the Quran many, many times. I want to feel comfortable with it. I've had endless conversations with Sufis in their decades about what they think their religion is doing for them. It's wonderfully liberating and thrilling for me. And the thing that I would, now to put it back into academic terms for you, is I've just finished my work in Ireland. It was 1982, the book Passing the Time in Ballymonone came out. That's about 3 square miles and 153 people. And I wanted to have the courage to talk about Turkey. And I had to rethink the whole propositions of ethnography, but I feel quite comfortable that I did. That as I came up to patterns of research that would work for me, I went to big markets that were the distribution centers for the objects made all over the country. And if I got good at the markets would lead me back to the manufacturers. And all I had to do then was to choose enough markets that would represent the kind of regional diversity. Now you see, I'm thinking just like pattern and material culture. Because I don't have to, in fact, go down every road in the United States and measure every barn in the United States. I have to find a reasonable sample. And so I make long, quick traverses in order to get basic patterns that I bear down. That's exactly what I did in Turkey. That is for the entire country. People in Turkey always say, you know, where have you been in Turkey? And I can say, I've been to Hakkari. That's the far southeastern state, and almost nobody in Turkey that doesn't live in Hakkari could. I remember being in the, so I was in the city of Van, and I I said to a man, Zekai, I said, I must go to Hakkari. Yeah, why in the world would anybody go to Hakkari? I said, well, you know, I need to have seen Hakkari, and it's interesting to me, and there's weaving there, I'm sure, weaving of very high quality, and I want to go to Hakkari. And so I said, does Hakkari have a hotel? Çok güzel bir hotel. Bir de Hotel de Yatak var. Not only does it have a hotel, but in the hotel there are beds. So I went to Hakkari. The point is, I chose certain places, that is places with a lot of Kurdish people, places that were Black Sea. I chose certain places around Turkey, and I treated them as markets. And the markets then would lead me out to the people who were making the things. So if I were to be, let's say, in the market in Malatya, and I would find carpets were sold, I would ask, I'm talking about new carpets, not carpets for tourists, and I'd say, where are these made? They're made in Adıyaman. Then I would get, you know, on the bus, Turkish bus service is so elegant. I would get on the bus and I would go to Adıyaman town. Then I'd find some guy to drive me out to Kuyucak. And there I would stay for 5 or 6 days and talk to the ladies who made the carpets. That's the way that I did it. And so I created a pattern over the country. It was kind of like a spider's web. Tremendous absences, but nodes of intense work. And so those nodes of intense work, one of them is the city of Kütahya, where pottery is made, but Adıyaman was another, where rugs are woven, Çanakkale. I went to certain places, Erzurum, right on the border with Iran. Just chose different places that had big markets that would lead me into the countryside so that I could balance urban and rural, so that I could balance male and female. Very important thing to do. So the carpets became my way into the woman's world. And it was very interesting that people think about perhaps Muslim women as being closed, but that's because you have a very shallow view. You get into the villages and Muslim women are really quite open and quite happy to involve themselves in a little bit of raunchy banter. It's not what you think. But perfectly happy, no problem at all, because as soon as you're adopted into relationships of fictive kin, there's no problem with you couldn't have some American sitting all day long with the women, but you can have my brother. And they all call me Amjad, my father's brother. You know, then that's okay. Then Amjad can sit here all day long. I literally, I mean, it seems, I wish to disturb slightly, maybe it's a goal of mine to disturb people's suppositions about Islam. But I literally slept in village houses that had 2 rooms. One room was always for the procreating parents. The other room was always for everybody else. And I was often sleeping at night in rooms with teenage girls.
Wow.
But the supposition of honor is so strong. And also, one would say, a threat. That is, I remember talking to a young woman who, myself, had just got married, and I said, well, it's always, marriage is always after local. So she was going to go to another village to live in. I said, are you going to have any trouble there? She says, I'm not going to have any trouble, I have brothers. There wouldn't be much question that if I had done something wrong, I would just simply be dead. It's not, you know, that wouldn't be, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. Just, I'd have been just killed, and I understood that. But my point is that my point is that that's the way that I solved the ethnographic problem of Turkey. And I did exactly the same thing in Bangladesh. And that's not, I'm not trying to preempt your questions, but the answer is how can you apply techniques that were worked out in a community that's 3 square miles and 153 people to try to deal with 80 million people. Yeah. And the only way I can do it is through accepting the structures of the public, that is to say markets. People gather in markets, and there are natural points of gathering, and furthermore, in those markets were the things sold that I was interested in, which were things that were made that were art, following, and I was completely directed, which is easy to do in Turkey, that if Hugh Nolan and Peter Flanagan could talk about Catholicism in a deeply moving way, when Ataturk gave his first speech to the Turkish people, he said that the Turks have 2 things. They're brave and they love art. Imagine the American president addressing the American people and saying, "You Americans, I know about you. You're brave and you love art." I mean, loving art would be pretty good. But the point is, Turkish working people really have terrific vocabulary for talking about art, which eased my job tremendously. That is, there's a word for art, and I just used it. And if I used their word for art, it was very easy for me to be led. What are you interested in now? I'm interested in sonata. Tamam. Gidebiliyoruz. Fine, we'll go. That was a thing that might have been difficult in some places, but it wasn't difficult. So then, I don't necessarily have to just repeat the story for Bangladesh, but to say that book about Turkey being written, and it's big, and the Turkish government approving it, I won the highest award for cultural service from the Turkish government for that book. And it's a book that the Turkish government has chosen to place in every embassy in the world.
Wow.
It's wonderful. And the Ministry of Culture keeps it in print. Then that excited the people of Bangladesh, the government in Bangladesh, to inviting me, which I think is wonderful, considered the kind of, nobody invited me to Turkey, I just bullied my way in. But in Bangladesh, I was invited, all my research was paid for by the Bangladeshi government. They wanted a book like the Turkish book. They were a little envious, and they thought that book, by concentrating on the things that people make that are beautiful, there's a representation of the country that doesn't have to skip around political and religious issues, but can represent the people in all their complexity. Wonderful review that was written in the front page of a major Turkish newspaper said, the author of it said, "I hold my nation in my hands with this book. I have the country in my hands, I can see it." Got over 1,000 photographs. And it's about 1,000 pages long, and so Bangladeshi said, "We'd like to have a book like that." And I said, "I don't know anything about your country." And Harun Rashid smiled at me and said, "Well, you can learn." You know, I just follow the same strategies in Bangladesh. Markets out to the artists.
Yeah, well, I don't want to give Bangladesh short shrift, but.
Everybody else does.
Is there more you can say about what was similar or different between the two projects with Turkey and Bangladesh? I mean, it sounds like you built yourself a set of tools that you then got to reuse over there, but of course you have a whole new language, it's a whole different set of issues there. But I'm also just aware of time, we need to talk about twins. And my God, we haven't talked about the importance of museums at all, or what you're working on now. And I also want to give them about 15 minutes. So we got about half an hour.
That's a lot. That's more time, I'm sure, than you all would like there to be.
So, which of those areas do you want to? Can we say a little bit more about Bangladesh, or you want to go move to twins?
I can a little bit because
Yeah.
I mean I try to think about things that might be relevant to somebody else. Here was one for Bangladesh that was different. That is to say, the project was in a way the same. It was wonderful feeling for me to be invited to do the work as opposed to feeling I was intruding. And that was a good thing. However, I did have an immediate problem that I didn't have in Turkey, and that is to say, Turkey is about 99% Muslim. So that there are obvious differences, you know, that you can, the Kurdish people and so on. But it isn't as conspicuous as it would be in Bangladesh, where about 10% of the population is Hindu. And there are two political parties, and one of those political parties is committed to welcoming Hindus. I mean, this is population that's, let's say, roughly the size of African Americans in the United States. And so that one of the parties is very interested in welcoming the presence of Hindus into government positions and welcoming Hindus into civil life, and the other one isn't. So that's not too unlike the United States. And so you've got a party that wants Hindu participation. Well, I chose to study a tradition that was largely in the hands of Hindus. And so that begins to bring me toward the topic that would be perhaps relevant to other people. I had to take a political stand. there was no way not to. And so that a political stand of a certain kind could have been avoided in Turkey, because but I didn't avoid it in the sense that I have lots of Kurdish people in my book, and I went to Kurdish areas, and that was all very out front, and the Turkish government thought that was just fine, as in republishing the book. But when I chose to emphasize in a book about the nation of Bangladesh, when I chose to emphasize the minority, it would be exactly as though a German came to the United States and wrote about the United States and largely talked about African Americans. That would be possible, but it would be interesting and conceivably jarring to a certain percentage of the population. And so I realizing this problem at first, I simply was the same kind of passive, docile person that field workers always are initially in your work. You have to be, because you have to sort of not take stands in order to make sure that you have some information from everybody. Ultimately, you're going to be forced into a stand. And so ultimately, I had to, not only in the book, but in all the newspaper accounts that came out about the book, and furthermore, the book led to, as much of my, you said museums, as much of my work has done, it's led to building museum exhibit as well. That is, I think that books communicate to a certain population, and museum exhibits communicate frequently to another population. And so I built a really gigantic exhibition at the Bangladesh National Museum. And in that museum, because at that time Sheikh Hasina was the prime minister, and she belonged to the Awami League, and this is not necessarily information for me, but the Awami League is the liberal political party. It would be analogous to the Democratic Party, but even, I'm sorry to say, better. And Sheikh Hasina asked me to build this exhibition. And she said, only a foreigner could build this exhibition, and you know why that's true. And of course I did. What she meant was that she wanted heavy Hindu presence in the exhibition. And so that when I built the exhibition, I literally, these are all living artists, no historical works. I not only collected works, but I brought everybody who made anything to the exhibition, so that at the opening they were all standing next to their works. And I carefully had exactly 50% Hindus and 50% Muslims, exactly 50% women and 50% men. Not hard at all in Bangladesh, because many of the most exquisite crafts are in the hands of women, so that I didn't have to be, it wasn't affirmative action, it was just that was good. And the newspaper accounts that followed that were some of them extremely hostile. I liked it. But that's not something you could like in your first year, or your second year, or your third year. But by that time, I'd been in Bangladesh for 10 years, and it was time for me to take a stand. And so that we had a public meeting about, was it proper to have a picture of Hindu deities, Radha and Krishna, on the cover of a book that was called Art and Life in Bangladesh. Hindus couldn't participate in the argument. They came. It was a big public meeting. It was very exciting. And the Hindu people felt that they didn't have the power to argue, and the whole thing was argued out by Muslims exactly as I thought it would be. I knew that there would be liberal Muslims with a Sufi inflection that would end up on my side, and they did so. I didn't even have to say anything. But it was a formal debate that took place between people who thought this was wrong and people who thought this was right. And the consequences that the book was then published in Bangladesh and is now being translated into Bangla right now by a nice guy called Shafiq Chaudhry. So that but it is not a view, I mean, that is to say that if you were in Bangladesh and looking at that book, you could say, this is not a view of Bangladesh. This is an Awami League view of Bangladesh. I don't mind. I don't mind. I mean, in the same way that Oscar Lewis, I said Oscar Lewis, he didn't mind saying, I am a socialist. Now, here's my scholarship. You can trust it or not trust it. And I said exactly the same thing in Bangladesh. I didn't have to say anything quite that dramatic in Turkey, but I would have been happy to do so if necessary. But Turkey is liberalizing very rapidly, and you really could find no end of Turks who will defend your position in Turkey. It's not a problem. But in Bangladesh, it was much more tense. And I liked it. It didn't bother me at all. That's a statement about ethnography, not about me, you understand. That at some point, if you're doing really long-range ethnography, I had at that time 10 years of visiting Bangladesh in place. At that point, you can't just be neutral anymore. It's certainly Ray knows perfectly well that my writings in Ireland are not perceived as being neutral. That guy's a Catholic sympathizer. Guess what? I am. I like the Protestant people, I got along with them, I interviewed them, I was friendly with them. But my political position was more clearly represented by the national. I just think border through Ireland was a dumb idea. That's a little brutal.
Well, okay, it would be artificial to say, and then Henry entered his Nigerian phase, because I don't think that some morning you said, "God, I'm interested in Nigeria, I better find an artist." You knew this fella, Twin 77, and this is a big shift in scale, down to one person. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about your inspiration for your interest in twins, and then maybe you could say something about the differences in that kind of a project, how it's a model for another different type of model for folklore studies. And then after that, it would be nice to say, if you want to say a little bit about what you plan to work on, what you're working on now in the future, but like I said, I'd like to leave a few minutes for questions.
Okay.
So I'll let you choose your own adventure there.
Yeah, there's the twin. I try to pull out of this egomaniacal rant something that could conceivably be useful for somebody else. And that one of the things that I learned from the other writings that I just talked about is that there's a way in which you can do straight-ahead scholarly work and be of tremendous benefit to individuals. And that I haven't yet stressed, and so let me do that. Because when I first came into the little city of Pawtucket, of which I am now an honorary citizen, I met some young artists who were on their way up. I featured them in my writing. They now drive Mercedes. I think that's just fine. That is, I think it's the benefit that it's necessary to manage, but I think it's wonderful to benefit the people. After my book in Bangladesh was published, the Academy of Art of the nation of Bangladesh decided that the people that were in my book are of the kind that had been neglected by the Academy of Art, and they would choose somebody right from my book to give a major monetary award. They chose a Potter, Imran Chand, and we hugged and it's sweaty and so on. He can say, I got $1,000 and a gold medal because of your book. It's a good thing. That's a good thing. And I don't think it's meant any diminishing whatsoever of the academic quality of what I do. It's just that kind of scholarly attention really has terrific benefit to people. Well, at any rate, why am I saying this? In the city of Philadelphia, ran into Twin 77. My dear friend, Robert Plant Armstrong, had written an essay in the early 70s about twins and what a great artist he was. And I said, what in the world is, in my opinion, Twin 77, maybe the most important modern artist in Nigeria running as a caretaker for a parking lot in Philadelphia. How in the hell did this happen? And that story is told in the book, but the answer in my mind was, if I were to write a book about twins, it's quite possible that it would benefit his career. Now, that wasn't the only thing that I had in mind, but I started right with that supposition that one of the things that I would like to do is to bring Twin 77, who had been, he made his first work in 1964 when he was 20 years old, and by 1967, he was a world famous African artist. And now it's 2004, and he's been forgotten. I could do something about that. Furthermore, I could do something about myself, because I've always wanted an excuse, this kind of thing that I do in my work, excuse to learn a lot about Africa. I've read books on African art for my entire life. What fun to really have to bear down on the topic of Africa, in the same way that I did bear down on the topic of Bangladesh. It's not just a matter of writing about Bangladesh, it's you have to read several hundred books on South Asian history. That's fun. To write about Turkey, I mean, you get good at the language. I've read all these art history books in Turkish. I mean, that's fun. It makes you deeper and smarter. And so I said, man, what an opportunity to learn about African art and maybe get to go to the place. So what was I gonna do with Twin 77? Exactly what Paul Clayton did with Mrs. McAllister, what Roger Abrams did with Almeda Riddle. That was my model, absolutely my model, an old-fashioned, Kenny Goldstein was always interested in repertory studies, and so I said, this is a chance to do exactly that. I mentioned very briefly Shafiq Chaudhry, who's the one who's right now translating my overly large book on Bangladesh into Bangla. But Shafiq, I taught him field work, and he's published an unbelievable study of a particular Sufi singer from Bangladesh, 600 pages long. And what did he do? Just what I told him ought to be done, and because he's a provincial, he actually did it. And that is every single song, he has an interview with the man about what he thinks that song is. And that's what I did with Twins. I mean, that's the thing that I think insofar to be a model to anybody. It's depressing to me that we have people that we can talk to, but somehow feel that we have to operate like art historians. I'm saying art historians do the right thing by Raphael. You can't talk to him, but if Raphael were alive, wouldn't it be foolish to ignore him? I remember once talking to Perlstein, who's a significant contemporary painter, and I said, has anybody ever interviewed you? No, he said, no, they're waiting for me to die. Then once he's dead, there'll be people studying just his things. You know, that seems to me really dumb. And so what an opportunity for me to have a great artist who's a good talker and who sees the benefit to him as well as me in sitting down and talking about every single painting at length. I recorded his life, that was of course what I did. But my model was Kenny's work with Sarah Cleveland and Roger's work with Almeda Riddle and Paul Clayton's work with Mrs. McAllister. That was my model, it was really old-fashioned folklore. But the difference with that old-fashioned folklore is it has the empirical stink that I love. That is to say, I actually did that instead of theorizing. You know what? We've had performance theory since 1964. And people are still calling that the new idea. You know? It's an old idea, it's a great idea, somebody ought to do it. And so that's exactly like this. I mean, here's the obvious thing that you would do is if you have an artist, you would interview them at great length about their biography, which is what I did with Twin 77. And then you would sit down, and it's not easy. It isn't comfortable for him, but I just made him tell me what every single painting was about. Sometimes we had to go back over them if I was not quite satisfied that he'd gotten down with the stories. But then that's what that book is. It has all those paintings, and every one of them has his exegesis, not mine. And that seems to me a real easy model, but it's pretty hard to do. Because I recur only for this clause to Peter Flanagan. You know, if we think about these people that we're working with as being our friends, we can place obligations on them. Somehow that you think that the way to do field work is to be a good guy, aloneness, to be a serious worker, and to be able to talk to people about why it is that we have to talk about this issue. I don't want to talk about it. You pretend you're my friend? Let's talk about it. And that was the same way. I put terrific obligations on Peter. He would really say, I have passages in my writings on Ballymanon about that. He'd say, I'd really rather not talk about this. And I said, well, okay, Peter, nuts and nuts. You're my friend. Let's talk about it. This is important stuff. We've got to get the story out to the world. All right, well then we'll do it. Same way with Twins. He would get tired and he'd say, oh, you know, I'm not sure we want to do this. I said, yeah, we do. Because this is your book and this is my book and we want it to be good. And the tragedy of all of this story, of course, is that Twins is younger than I am, and therefore I assumed that he would live a long life. And in June of 2011, he dropped dead. Fortunately, he had the book for a long time before that. That was a victory, but it was ultimately a defeat, because I thought I was really going to get his career back. So now, when the auctions sell his works, a lot of them recently, the prices have gone way up. He's not benefiting. So that was a kind of a failure. But I don't think it isn't a failure if I trust the opinions of his children. He has 37 of them. And he was an aloof person. We didn't know the old man. His son talked to him. We didn't know him at all. He was over in the corner, he was painting. We didn't know what he was up to. But he told you, and now we have it. And so the kids had a service in which they just read aloud from the book. Because I transcribed it so exactly, they said it just sounds exactly the way we talk. So that's a nice thing, but on the other hand, it's a to me, it's a treats thing. I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to do for twins what I would like to have done. It was a try. I learned a great deal about African art. But I miss the man. That's the other thing, you know, it's I've never wept as much as I did when Hugh Nolan died. Knowing exactly what he knew and how much he meant, how deep all that information he was carrying away. My father and mother died. I was a little sad. Hugh Nolan died. I didn't recover for a week. Twin 77 is not the kind of guy who's a pain in the ass, not the kind of guy that you weep for. But this is a fact. As soon as he died, of course, don't belong in this world, and I keep time in my house by an 18th century French clock. And as soon as he died, that clock now strikes 7 twice in every 12-hour sequence. Twin 77. Can't have any meaning, can it? But for some reason, it strikes 7 at 7, and generally at 4, it strikes 7 too. I don't know.
I can't follow that except. Of course, I've got more questions, but I think it's only right to open up the floor for the last 10 minutes that we have to questions from the audience. And if you don't ask questions, I'll ask more.
Maybe somebody has a. Yes.
I'm not sure there are many other members of AFS who've been members since 1964. So, and since you're kind of legendary for detecting patterns, I wonder if you can reflect upon the patterns you've observed in the American Folklore Society, or patterns among the students that you've been teaching for many years.
Oh, I think that's actually. I don't have that worked up, but I didn't really have any of this worked up. When I first was here, I was at the very first meeting I went to was in New York City, and I think that was 64 or 5. Probably 65. I believe it would have been. Were you there? It was the time that Kenny baffled Dorson's run for the presidency. And it seemed to me then that collecting was really leading.
Yeah.
That is, it was really a virtuous thing to have gone out into the world and to have gathered new information, particular information that was in frames. That is to say, it wasn't like ethnography, which is open but somewhat narrow. We liked child ballads, we liked stories with numbers in the Aaron Thompson Index. And that was an acceptable, in fact, I still think it a noble activity. I think that maybe the ghost of Alan Dundas has caused us to feel that we have to do more than collecting, but I actually think collecting in itself is a great virtue. Things are put in archives, they're always there. I've been amazed in my own life of things that I've put in archives that have then been beneficial to somebody that I hadn't anticipated. So the mere act of collecting things is historically important. We say, well, there's always going to be folklore. There's always going to be folklore. There are always traditions. I mean, people can't stop telling stories. They'll always tell stories. But they're going to tell different stories. So everything ought to be recorded and preserved. So the preservation, I would say, was the first move. Then I would say in the late 60s and 70s, there was the wonderful New Perspectives move. That would be Dan and Roger and Alan, and that was the kind of onflow from the middle of the 1960s. And I think that set up a terrific mood. What I think is interesting today is the degree to which maybe the transformation of ideas in that when I was first here, the enemy was popular culture. And now I say the majority of younger folklorists are studying popular culture.
Yeah.
I'm not putting any approval or disapproval on that fact. It's just an interesting fact. That it seems to me, I don't think it's an accident. I think that if you think about I'd like to now position the society, I haven't given you the kind of answer maybe you'd like, but I'd like to position the society in the larger frame. And the larger frame is that there was a postmodern moment, and it isn't just vague, it's very specific. It's the moment when people turned away from looking at exotic societies for the solution to modern problems and looked back nostalgically upon the urban popular past. That is, it's when Jasper Johns made the Valentine beer cans. That's the key. I think that's the key moment. It's like 1958-59. It's the Andy Warhol time. All of a sudden, the attention was turned away from looking. That is the folklorists of my generation thought that the exciting thing was to go up into the mountains and meet other people. And then there was a dramatic change that happened in consequence of the postmodern change, which was no longer to be interested in other people so much as you're interested in yourself and interested in your own popular culture. I think it's really a dramatic change. I think if that's not a very neat chronological sequence, because what I would assert between that is preservation as a goal, new perspectives of the goal. The next move, I think, is an adjustment to the public sector. The presence of the Office of Folk Life Programs at the Smithsonian, the presence of the panel of the National Endowment for the Arts. That, I think, led to a kind of crisis moment at maybe the Pittsburgh meetings, which I think was a shallow crisis, and I don't personally think of much importance, but I think it was a consequence of going public, and in the public sphere, we were perhaps a little embarrassed by calling ourselves folklorists. Olivia Cadival was very good about that yesterday, that when she talks with Latin American scholars, she can't use the word folklore. At the very same time, that's not universal. In Ireland, the word folklore is fine.
Sure.
Peter Flanagan used the word folklore for what he did. That was comfortable for him because of the importance of folklore. I dramatically remember Clete Medders, Potter, at Maggie was there, saying, "Don't take the word folk from me. It's what my bread and butter is. If you don't call me a folk potter, I'm sunk, because then I have to compete with industrial potters.
Yeah.
But if you allow me to be called a folk potter, I dig my own clay, I make my own glazes. That's what a folk potter is."
Sure.
So I think I've sketched clumsily a kind of sequence of moves. Preservation, new perspectives, public orientation, pop culture. I think those are really interesting big patterns in what I've seen in the papers, is kind of incorporation of popular culture, the incorporation of, and the anxiety about the presentation of the folklore self on the public stage, creating many crises. That's a little bit quick, but that is a reaction to a long time here.
I have a question.
Marge?
Yeah. Well, if you could have your wish list, or if you can think in terms of what is being neglected by folklorists that should be attended to, what would some of those things be?
I think that one of the things that folklorists study is revival. I think it'd be interesting to think about the discipline as having a revival. And one of the things that I think that would be really interesting to reconsider all those things that we've rejected in the past. That sounds like a little bit tricky, but it's exactly what I do believe. I think one of the most interesting things for us to do is to go back and reconsider. Was the historic geographic method completely stupid? No. Was it really pointless for us to have that long engagement that the discipline had largely through the ballad to literature? Was that a bad move? Not at all. It's a good move. What I think that is, those wouldn't be my primary interest. My primary interest would obviously be would come out of my own experience. And I think that no, let me wipe that sentence out and say that the most important move, I think, in the development of the current public sector was made by Ralph Rensler. When Ralph set up the Folklife Festival in 1967, I was there. I was part of that festival. Pennsylvania was featured because I was the Pennsylvania State Folklorist at that time. Ralph Rensler had a vision that was unfortunately lost. What he hoped there would be was supported, long-range, intense ethnographic work that would produce the people who would appear in the festival. That first part has been cut off. So really what I wish is that there would be that complete Ralph Rensler vision of what we're up to would be recaptured. That is to say, we would not start with the responsibility of putting on a festival. We would start with the responsibility of pure scientific research in the field. That's what I really believe, number one, we would do. And then that would naturally lead to folk festivals and naturally lead even to the kinds of ameliorating activist things that are beyond folk festivals and normal public sector work. I think it ought to lead straight into social activism and social justice. But I think those things should be coordinated as a program, and that's exactly what Ralph Rensler wanted to do. When he set up the Office of Folklife Programs in the Smithsonian, that was his goal. Immediately it was truncated. Immediately it was made into entertainment. And I'm not going to be stand here to be very negative about the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, it having been so important. But it is a tragedy and a travesty that the original plan that Ralph Rensler had for the Office of Folklife Programs has not been met. And you see, I can hear somebody talk about the bottom line. Right today, the nation of Bangladesh has 300 professional folklorists doing full-time field work.
Wow.
It's one of the two poorest countries in the world.
That's
If
amazing.
the nation of Bangladesh can hire 300 professional folklorists, each one is given a district, but there are 5 working together in every district. Somebody does material culture, somebody does festivals, somebody's recording music. You got an ethnomusicologist, a material culture specialist. They're working as little teams in every single district of the nation. Bangladesh is the size of Louisiana. Imagine, it's exactly the same size. Imagine having 300 professional folklorists loose and at work, not having to teach or not having to do anything except to write reports. So you say, well, we couldn't do that. You know, how much should 300 folklorists, tally up the price of those damn drones that are murdering the citizens of Afghanistan.
That's right.
And see if we could use that money some different way. I mean, if Bangladesh can put 300 folklorists in the field, the United States could put 3,000 folklorists in the field just like that. So at any rate, what I really think is, there are lots of nice things that I would love to see the discipline doing. I mean, there's Joe Penland down there in Madison County, North Carolina, knows all those child ballads still. Why isn't somebody up there writing his biography? But what I'm much more moved by is the proposition of the coordination of project that would lead all the way from pure ethnographic research to social justice, with a halfway house in festivals and the like. That is to say, so that you would, what did I just say? I wish the academics, public sector distinctions would just go away, and we'd all realize that we're part of a single enterprise, and that enterprise can't exist without intense long-term field work, and it can't exist without the effort to help.
Amen.